The silence in my Halifax home was broken by the most chilling words I'd ever heard. "Grandma, Mommy's in there," my 5-year-old granddaughter Emma whispered, pointing at the living room wall with her tiny finger. What happened next would unravel a web of lies, betrayal, and secrets that had been festering in my family for months. Secrets that would cost me everything I held dear and force me to fight for the most precious thing in my life, the truth. My name is Dorothy Bennett, and I'm 65 years old. I've lived in this modest 2-story house in Halifax, Nova Scotia for 37 years. It's where I raised my son Michael, where I celebrated countless Christmas mornings, birthday parties, and family gatherings. The pale blue walls hold memories of laughter, tears, and the simple joys of a life well lived. After my husband Arthur passed away 3 years ago from cancer, this house became my sanctuary, a place where I could find peace in my golden years and cherish the time with my only grandchild. That particular autumn afternoon, I was babysitting Emma, while my son Michael and his wife Sarah attended what they claimed was a mandatory work conference in Toronto. They'd been traveling frequently for business lately, sometimes leaving Emma with me for days at a time. I didn't mind, quite the opposite. Emma was the light of my life, a spirited little girl with curly auburn hair and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. She had been staying with me for 3 days, and we'd fallen into a comfortable routine of reading stories, baking cookies, and playing her favorite games. We were sitting on the living room carpet, working on a 500-piece puzzle of a fairy tale castle, when Emma suddenly stopped what she was doing. Her small face grew serious, and she stared intently at the wall behind our old mahogany entertainment center. The wall had been recently painted. Michael had insisted on doing it himself during his last visit, claiming the old paint was chipping and needed refreshing. I remembered thinking it was odd how quickly he'd completed the job, working late into the night while Sarah kept Emma distracted upstairs. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked, following her gaze to the wall. My heart was beating normally then, innocent and unaware of the storm that was about to break over our lives. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper, the way children do when they're sharing something they're not sure they should. "Daddy said it's our secret." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Mommy's in there and she's sleeping, but Daddy said we can't tell anyone because it's our special secret." The room temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. My hands trembled as I set down the puzzle piece I'd been holding. Every instinct I'd developed as a mother and grandmother screamed that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Emma wasn't the type of child to make up elaborate stories, and the way she spoke, with that mixture of innocence and fear, sent ice through my veins. "Emma, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced through terrible possibilities. "When did Daddy tell you this?" "When we painted the wall," she replied matter-of-factly, then returned to her puzzle as if she hadn't just spoken words that would haunt me forever. My hands shaking, I reached for my phone and dialed Michael's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before he answered. But the voice that came through the speaker wasn't the confident, cheerful tone of my son that I knew and loved. It was weak, trembling, filled with what sounded like terror. "Mom," he whispered, and I could hear what sounded like sirens in the background. "Get out of the house now. Take Emma and get out. Don't ask questions, just go. I'll explain everything later, but please, for the love of God, get out of there right now." The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the house that had been my safe haven for decades. But inside, everything I thought I knew about my family was crumbling around me. If you're watching this story unfold, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. I need to know I'm not alone in this nightmare. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your support means everything to me as I share the most difficult chapter of my life. With Emma's hand clutched tightly in mine, I ran from my house like it was on fire. My legs, weakened by age and arthritis, carried me faster than they had in years. We drove to the nearest Tim Hortons, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. I ordered Emma a hot chocolate and tried to appear calm while my world spun out of control. "Are we playing a game, Grandma?" Emma asked innocently, her little legs swinging from the cafe chair. "Yes, darling," I whispered, fighting back tears. "A very important game." 30 minutes later, 3 police cruisers and an ambulance screamed past the coffee shop windows, heading in the direction of my neighborhood. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Stay away. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." The next 3 hours were a blur of police interviews, social workers, and the gradual revelation of a truth so horrific I still wake up in cold sweats. Detective Maria Santos, a kind woman with gentle eyes who specialized in family crimes, sat across from me in the police station and delivered news that shattered my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my son. "Mrs. Bennett," she said softly, "we found human remains behind the wall in your living room. We believe they belong to your daughter-in-law, Sarah Mackenzie. She's been missing for 2 weeks, though no one reported her disappearance." The room spun. I gripped the metal table so hard my knuckles turned white. "That's impossible," I gasped. "Sarah was with Michael at a conference. They left together. I saw them leave." Detective Santos pulled out a folder thick with photographs and documents. "Mrs. Bennett, your son Michael has confessed to murdering his wife during a domestic dispute 2 weeks ago. He concealed her body behind the newly constructed wall in your living room while you were out grocery shopping. He's been pretending she was alive, even staging phone calls and text messages from her phone to maintain the illusion." The world tilted on its axis. My Michael, my gentle, quiet son, who used to catch spiders in cups and release them outside rather than kill them, was a murderer, and he had turned my home, my sanctuary, into a tomb. "Where is my son now?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. "He's been arrested and is being held without bail." "Mrs. Bennett, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Did you have any knowledge of your daughter-in-law's death? Did you notice anything unusual about your son's behavior in recent weeks?" For the next 2 hours, I answered every question with painful honesty. No, I had no knowledge of Sarah's death. Yes, Michael had seemed more anxious lately, but I attributed it to work stress. No, I had never suspected he was capable of violence. The detective's questions felt like accusations, each one cutting deeper into my heart, but the worst revelation was yet to come. Detective Santos leaned forward and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Bennett, there's something else. We've discovered that your son has been systematically draining Sarah's bank accounts and investment funds over the past 6 months. He's stolen approximately $847,000 from her personal savings and her share of their joint assets. We believe he was planning to disappear with Emma and start a new life somewhere else." $847,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had been a successful real estate agent with investments inherited from her parents. She had worked tirelessly to build her financial security, often talking about setting up a college fund for Emma that would ensure her daughter never had to struggle financially. "He stole her life's work," I whispered, finally understanding the full scope of my son's betrayal. "He killed her, and then stole everything she'd worked for." Detective Santos nodded grimly. "We're still investigating, but it appears this may have been premeditated. The financial theft began months before the murder." As night fell over Halifax, I sat in that sterile police station conference room, holding Emma while she slept, and tried to comprehend how my life had become a nightmare. My son was a murderer and a thief. My home was a crime scene. My granddaughter was now an orphan who had been manipulated into keeping the secret of her mother's death. But even in that moment of devastating revelation, I didn't know that my fight was just beginning. I didn't know that Michael's family, Sarah's estranged siblings, would soon emerge from the shadows with accusations that would threaten to destroy what little remained of my shattered world. The funeral parlor smelled of lilies and grief, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah's service was held 5 days after her body was recovered from my living room wall, and I sat in the front row clutching Emma's small hand, surrounded by hostile stares and whispered accusations. Sarah's brother, David Mackenzie, a corporate lawyer from Toronto whom I'd met only twice in 5 years, stood at the podium delivering a eulogy that felt more like an indictment. His words were carefully chosen, but the venom was unmistakable. Sarah was a loving mother and successful businesswoman who deserved so much better than the betrayal she suffered, he said, his cold blue eyes finding mine across the crowded room. She trusted the wrong people, and that trust cost her everything: her life, her financial security, and her daughter's future. The implication was clear. In David's mind, I was complicit in my son's crimes simply by being Michael's mother. After the service, he approached me with his sister Linda, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive black suit who worked as a financial advisor in Vancouver. "Dorothy," David said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We need to talk about Emma's future. Clearly, she can't remain in your care given the circumstances." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Linda stepped forward, clutching a manila folder against her chest like a weapon. "We mean that you're either criminally negligent or criminally complicit. Our sister died in your house, Dorothy. Her body was decomposing behind your living room wall for 2 weeks while you babysat Emma as if nothing had happened." I had no idea. "Didn't you smell anything?" David interrupted, his voice rising. "Didn't you notice that your son was acting strangely? Didn't you question why Sarah suddenly stopped calling or visiting? Either you're lying or you're too incompetent to care for a 5-year-old child." The funeral parlor had emptied except for us, but their voices echoed off the walls like gunshots. Emma, who had been remarkably composed throughout the service, began to cry. I pulled her closer, my protective instincts overriding my shock at their accusations. "Emma belongs with family who actually cared about her mother," Linda continued ruthlessly. "Family who won't expose her to murderers and criminals. We're filing for emergency custody, and we have enough evidence to ensure you never see her again." The folder in Linda's hands contained what they claimed was proof of my negligence. Photographs of my house, statements from neighbors about strange smells they now claimed to have noticed, and most damaging of all, a recorded statement from Michael's cellmate claiming that Michael had bragged about how easily he'd fooled his stupid old mother. "Even if you're not criminally liable," David said with cruel satisfaction, "you're clearly not fit to raise a child. Sarah told us how you spoiled Emma, how you undermined their parenting decisions, how you were always interfering in their marriage. These were lies, complete fabrications, but I could see how easily they could be twisted to support their narrative. Every grandmother's natural desire to spoil her grandchild, every small disagreement about bedtime or candy, every moment of ordinary family tension was being weaponized against me. We've already contacted Child Protective Services," Linda announced. "They'll be conducting a formal investigation into your fitness as a guardian. We've also retained a family law attorney who specializes in custody cases involving criminal families." The words criminal families hit me like a slap. In their eyes, I wasn't Dorothy Bennett, retired schoolteacher and loving grandmother. I was the mother of a murderer, guilty by association, unworthy of raising the one precious thing left in my shattered world. "You can't take her from me," I whispered, holding Emma tighter. "She's all I have left. She's all we have left of Sarah," David replied coldly. "And we're not going to let her be raised by the family that destroyed her mother." As they walked away, leaving me standing alone with Emma in that funeral parlor, I realized that my nightmare was far from over. Michael's crime had been the earthquake, but David and Linda Mackenzie were the tsunami, and they were determined to wash away every trace of my connection to Emma. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed in the hotel room where we were staying while my house remained a crime scene, she looked up at me with those innocent hazel eyes and asked, "Grandma, why were those people so mean to you?" I smoothed her hair and tried to find words that wouldn't add to her trauma. "Sometimes when people are very sad, they say things they don't mean, sweetheart." But I knew David and Linda Mackenzie meant every word, and I knew that the fight for Emma's future and for my own redemption was just beginning. The Child Protective Services office in downtown Halifax felt like a tribunal designed to determine my worth as a human being. 3 weeks after Sarah's funeral, I sat across from caseworker Jennifer Walsh, a stern woman in her 40s, who reviewed my file with the detached efficiency of someone who'd seen too many broken families. "Mrs. Bennett," she began, adjusting her reading glasses, "these are serious allegations. The Mackenzie family has provided substantial documentation suggesting that you may have been aware of suspicious circumstances surrounding your daughter-in-law's disappearance." The substantial documentation was a masterpiece of manipulation. David and Linda had interviewed neighbors, former colleagues of Sarah's, and even Emma's kindergarten teacher, carefully crafting a narrative that painted me as either willfully blind or deliberately complicit. They'd hired a private investigator who dug up every minor family dispute, every moment of ordinary tension, and presented them as evidence of a dysfunctional household. "Mrs. Walsh," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I loved Sarah like my own daughter. I would never have done anything to harm her, and I certainly would never have allowed my granddaughter to live in a house where I knew her mother's body was hidden." But I could see the doubt in the caseworker's eyes. The story was almost too horrific to believe. How could a grandmother live in a house with her murdered daughter-in-law's remains without suspecting anything? The Mackenzies had found expert witnesses, including a forensic pathologist who testified that the decomposition would have produced noticeable odors within days. There's also the matter of your financial situation, Mrs. Walsh continued, pulling out another section of the thick file. The Mackenzie family has raised concerns about your ability to provide for Emma's needs. This was where their attack became truly vicious. After Arthur's death, I'd been living on his pension and my modest teacher's retirement savings, approximately $3,200 per month, enough for my simple lifestyle but barely adequate for raising a child in 2024's economy. Sarah had been contributing $800 monthly toward Emma's expenses when she stayed with me, money that had obviously stopped coming after her death. David Mackenzie, meanwhile, earned over $180,000 annually as a corporate lawyer, while Linda's financial advisory business generated approximately $95,000 per year. On paper, they could provide Emma with private schools, extracurricular activities, college savings plans, and opportunities I simply couldn't afford. Mrs. Bennett, the caseworker said with what might have been sympathy, Emma has been through tremendous trauma. She needs stability, financial security, and perhaps most importantly, a home environment free from the psychological damage of her father's crimes. The psychological evaluation came next, 2 hours with Dr. Rebecca Chen, a child psychologist who would determine Emma's mental state and make recommendations about her placement. I waited in the hallway while Emma played with toys and answered questions about her feelings, her nightmares, her understanding of what had happened to her mother. When Dr. Chen emerged, her expression was carefully neutral. Mrs. Bennett, Emma clearly loves you very much, and she's expressed a strong desire to remain in your care. However, she's also showing signs of post-traumatic stress that may require specialized treatment. Another weapon in the Mackenzies' arsenal. They could afford the best child psychologists, trauma therapists, and specialized care that my fixed income couldn't begin to cover. Emma's healing had become a commodity, and I was being priced out of my granddaughter's recovery. But the cruelest twist came during my third meeting with the caseworker, when Mrs. Walsh revealed that Michael had been making statements from prison that supported his in-laws' case. Your son has signed an affidavit stating that he believes Emma would be better served living with the Mackenzie family, she said, sliding the document across the desk. He's expressed concern about your age, your health, and your ability to provide the kind of structured environment Emma needs. Reading Michael's statement felt like being stabbed by someone I'd raised and loved for 35 years. Every private conversation about my arthritis, every moment when I'd felt tired or overwhelmed, every human limitation of aging had been twisted into evidence that I was unfit to raise Emma. My own son, the murderer, was testifying against me to save face with his victim's family. He's trying to reduce his sentence by cooperating with the prosecution, Mrs. Walsh explained clinically. His attorney has advised that supporting the Mackenzies' custody petition demonstrates remorse and concern for his daughter's welfare. As I left the CPS office that gray November afternoon, I realized that this wasn't just a custody battle. It was a war for the narrative of who I was. In the Mackenzies' version, I was either a criminal conspirator or a negligent old woman too feeble to protect a child. In Michael's version, I was a loving but inadequate grandmother who meant well but couldn't provide what Emma needed. But they had all forgotten one crucial thing. I was a retired school teacher who had spent 42 years fighting for children, and I wasn't about to stop fighting for the most important child in my world. The Mackenzies had money, lawyers, and public sympathy on their side. I had something they didn't: the absolute, unshakable love of a grandmother who would move mountains to protect her granddaughter. Hope came in the form of Margaret O'Brien, a 73-year-old retired family court judge who knocked on my hotel room door on a cold December morning. She stood in the hallway wearing a simple wool coat and a determined expression that reminded me of my own reflection when I'd made up my mind about something important. "Dorothy Bennett?" she asked in a voice that carried decades of courtroom authority. "My name is Margaret O'Brien. I've been following your case in the news, and I believe you're being railroaded by people who care more about money than about that little girl." Margaret had presided over family court for 26 years before retiring, and she'd seen enough custody battles to recognize a vendetta when she saw one. More importantly, she'd known Sarah professionally. Sarah had handled the sale of Margaret's family home 2 years earlier, and they developed a friendship that gave Margaret insights the Mackenzies' lawyers didn't have. "Sarah talked about you constantly," Margaret told me as we sat in the hotel's modest breakfast area, Emma coloring at a nearby table. "She worried that you were too generous, too giving. She said Michael's family treated you better than her own family ever had. She specifically told me that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped Emma would grow up surrounded by the same unconditional love you'd shown her." These weren't just comforting words. They were the testimony of someone who could speak to Sarah's true feelings about our family relationship. Margaret had documented their conversations in her personal journal, entries that directly contradicted the Mackenzies' claims about family dysfunction, and Sarah's alleged concerns about my influence on Emma. But Margaret brought more than moral support. She'd contacted her former colleague, Justice Thomas Crawford, who'd agreed to oversee the custody hearing personally. More crucially, she'd reached out to her extensive network of retired legal professionals who volunteered their time for worthy causes. "There's something else," Margaret said, pulling out a manila envelope that looked suspiciously similar to the ones the Mackenzies always carried. "I hired my own private investigator to look into David and Linda Mackenzie's backgrounds. You might be interested in what he found." The investigation revealed cracks in the Mackenzies' perfect facade. David had been disciplined twice by the Law Society of Ontario for mishandling client trust funds, minor infractions that resulted in reprimands rather than suspension, but concerning nonetheless. Linda's financial advisory business had been investigated by provincial regulators for questionable investment strategies that had cost several elderly clients significant losses. More importantly, the investigator had uncovered the truth about the Mackenzies' relationship with Sarah. Far from being loving siblings, they'd been estranged for over 3 years following a bitter dispute over their parents' estate. Sarah had inherited the family home and a substantial investment portfolio, while David and Linda received smaller cash settlements. They'd contested the will, claiming their younger sister had manipulated their aging parents, and the legal battle had destroyed their relationship. "They're not fighting for Emma out of love," Margaret explained grimly. "They're fighting for control of Sarah's estate. As Emma's guardians, they would manage the $847,000 that Michael stole, if it's ever recovered, plus Sarah's life insurance policy, her real estate holdings, and her investment accounts. We're talking about approximately $1.2 million in total assets." The money trail painted a devastating picture. If the Mackenzies gained custody of Emma, they would control her inheritance until she turned 18, 13 years during which they could legally invest, manage, and potentially misappropriate funds under the guise of caring for her needs. Their sudden interest in their beloved niece coincided suspiciously with the discovery of Sarah's financial assets, but our strongest ally emerged from an unexpected source: Emma herself. Dr. Anne. Rebecca Chen, the child psychologist, had continued her sessions with Emma and made a discovery that would change everything. "Emma has been having nightmares," Dr. Chen reported during a meeting that Margaret had arranged, "but they're not about her mother's death or her father's arrest. She's been dreaming about being taken away from you, Mrs. Bennett. She's developed separation anxiety specifically related to the custody proceedings. The psychological evaluation that the Mackenzies had hoped would support their case was backfiring spectacularly. Emma's trauma responses were directly linked to the threat of losing me, not to living with me. Her emotional stability actually improved when she was in my care and deteriorated during supervised visits with her Mackenzie relatives. In my professional opinion," Dr. Chen continued, "removing Emma from Mrs. Bennett's care would cause additional psychological trauma that could have lasting effects on her development. The child has already lost her mother and, in practical terms, her father. Taking away her grandmother, her primary attachment figure, would be catastrophic." Margaret smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd been fighting these battles for decades. "Dorothy, we've got them on the run. Their financial motives are exposed, their character witnesses are questionable, and most importantly, Emma's own voice is being heard." As Christmas approached, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that terrible October afternoon when Emma pointed at my living room wall. Hope. The Mackenzies had underestimated the power of truth, the strength of genuine love, and the determination of a grandmother who would fight heaven and hell to protect her granddaughter. But I should have known that cornered predators are at their most dangerous. David and Linda Mackenzie weren't about to let $1.2 million slip through their fingers without one final devastating attack. The Mackenzies' final assault came during the week between Christmas and New Year's, when most people were celebrating with family and letting their guard down. I should have expected it. David Mackenzie hadn't built a successful law practice by playing fair or giving up easily. The first blow landed on December 28th, when Child Protective Services received an anonymous tip claiming that I was physically abusing Emma. Someone had called the hotline with a detailed story about seeing bruises on Emma's arms and witnessing me roughly handling her in the grocery store parking lot. Within 2 hours, Emma was removed from my care and placed in emergency foster care while CPS investigated the allegations. The speed of their response was stunning and suspicious. Anonymous tips usually took days to process, but this one had been escalated immediately through channels that suggested someone with influence had been pulling strings. Mrs. Bennett, Jennifer Walsh explained during an emergency meeting, "We have to take these allegations seriously." The caller provided specific details about dates, locations, and Emma's injuries that we need to investigate thoroughly. The details were indeed specific and completely fabricated. The bruises were described as being on Emma's left forearm, exactly where she'd gotten a small scratch playing in Margaret O'Brien's garden 3 days earlier. The rough handling allegedly occurred on December 26th at the Sobeys parking lot on Spring Garden Road, where Emma had indeed had a minor meltdown about wanting candy, and I'd had to physically guide her back to the car. Someone had been watching us. Someone had been documenting our daily activities and twisting ordinary moments of childhood and grandmothering into evidence of abuse. The second blow came on December 30th, when the Halifax Chronicle-Herald published a front-page story titled, "Grandmother of Murder Victim Investigated for Child Abuse." The article contained leaked details from the CPS investigation that should have been confidential, painting me as a woman whose judgment was so compromised by her son's crimes that she'd begun taking out her frustrations on an innocent child. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Dorothy Bennett may be suffering from psychological trauma related to her son's arrest, the article stated. Child welfare experts are concerned that her inability to recognize her son's dangerous behavior may extend to her care of her granddaughter. The story quoted anonymous family members expressing concern about my mental state and my fitness to care for Emma. It mentioned my age, my limited income, my lack of experience with childhood trauma, and most damaging of all, it suggested that Emma herself had begun showing signs of fear around me. Every word was designed to destroy my reputation and poison public opinion against me. The Mackenzies had learned from our earlier victories and decided that if they couldn't win in court, they'd win in the media. The third blow came on January 2nd, when I received notice that the Mackenzies were suing me personally for wrongful death and negligent supervision. The lawsuit claimed that my failure to detect my son's criminal behavior made me partially liable for Sarah's death, and they were seeking $2.3 million in damages. The legal theory was creative and vicious. If I was truly innocent of any knowledge about Sarah's murder, then I was negligently unaware of dangerous conditions in my home. If I had suspected something was wrong, then I was criminally complicit in concealing a crime. Either way, I was financially responsible for Sarah's death. "It's a classic legal squeeze play," Margaret O'Brien explained grimly. "They're trying to force you into bankruptcy while simultaneously arguing that your financial instability makes you unfit to raise Emma. Even if you eventually win the lawsuit, the legal fees alone will destroy you." The Mackenzies had retained one of Atlantic Canada's most expensive litigation firms, the kind of legal powerhouse that charged $800 per hour and specialized in crushing opponents through sheer financial attrition. Their strategy was simple: force me to spend money I didn't have defending myself against allegations I couldn't disprove, then use my resulting poverty as evidence that I couldn't provide for Emma. But the cruelest blow was personal. During my supervised visit with Emma on January 3rd, the first time I'd seen her since the abuse allegations, she ran to me with tears streaming down her face. "Grandma, why can't I come home?" she sobbed. "The foster lady is nice, but I want to be with you. Did I do something wrong? How do you explain to a 5-year-old that her dead mother's siblings are using her as a pawn in a financial game? How do you comfort a child who's already lost both parents and now believes she's losing her grandmother too. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart," I whispered, holding her as tightly as the social worker would allow. "Sometimes grown-ups have to solve very complicated problems, but I'm never going to stop fighting to bring you home." As I left that supervised visit, walking past the photographer who'd somehow learned about our meeting time and location, I realized that the Mackenzies had successfully painted me as either a criminal or a victim, and in their narrative, neither option made me suitable to raise Emma. But they had made one crucial mistake in their campaign to destroy me. They had underestimated the power of a grandmother's love and the determination of people who believe in justice. Margaret O'Brien had been making phone calls, and help was coming from directions the Mackenzies never expected. The war for Emma's future was about to take a turn that would shock everyone involved. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Michael himself. On January 15th, 3 months after his arrest, my son made a decision that would change everything. He fired his court-appointed attorney and retained a new lawyer with a very specific mission: to tell the complete truth about Sarah's death and clear my name. "Mom," Michael said during our first face-to-face conversation since his arrest, speaking through the reinforced glass at the Halifax Regional Correctional Center, "I can't let them destroy you for my crimes. You need to know everything that really happened." For the first time since October, my son looked like the man I'd raised, broken, haunted, but finally honest. The story he told me over the next hour was even more devastating than I'd imagined, but it also contained the evidence that would save Emma and me. The murder hadn't been a spontaneous domestic dispute, as Michael had originally claimed. It had been the culmination of months of financial pressure from David and Linda Mackenzie, who had been demanding that Sarah change her will to include them as Emma's guardians and beneficiaries of her estate. Sarah found out that David had been stealing from his law firm's client trust accounts, Michael explained, his voice barely above a whisper. She also discovered that Linda had been running investment scams targeting elderly clients. They were both facing potential criminal charges and financial ruin. Sarah had confronted her siblings with evidence of their crimes and threatened to report them to authorities unless they left her family alone. In response, David and Linda had begun a campaign of harassment designed to force Sarah to share her inheritance or face public exposure of family secrets they'd fabricated. They told Sarah they'd testify that our marriage was abusive, that I was stealing from her accounts, that Emma wasn't safe in our home. Michael continued. They had no evidence, but David knew how to manipulate the legal system. Sarah was terrified that they'd find a way to take Emma away from us. The financial theft had been Michael's desperate attempt to liquidate Sarah's assets before David and Linda could claim them. But when Sarah discovered the missing money, she'd threatened to call the police immediately. The argument that followed had escalated beyond anything Michael had intended. "I never meant to hurt her, Mom," he sobbed. "She said she was going to call David and tell him about the missing money, that she'd rather lose everything to him than let me steal from Emma's future. I lost control, but I swear to you, I never planned it." The most crucial revelation came when Michael produced a safety deposit box key that he'd hidden in his wallet. The box contained evidence that Sarah had been collecting against her siblings: financial records, recorded phone conversations, and a written statement detailing their threats against her and Emma. Sarah was documenting everything, Michael explained. She was planning to file charges against David and Linda, but she wanted to have enough evidence to make sure they couldn't retaliate. She was protecting Emma the only way she knew how. Margaret O'Brien's private investigator verified Michael's claims within 48 hours. The safety deposit box contained a treasure trove of evidence that painted the Mackenzies as the true villains in this tragedy. Sarah's journal entries described months of harassment, financial pressure, and veiled threats about Emma's custody. Most damaging of all was a recording Sarah had made of a phone conversation with David just 1 week before her death. In it, David explicitly threatened to destroy her pathetic little family and ensure that Emma never grows up thinking her mother was anything but a selfish bitch who chose her husband over her real family. The recording also revealed David's knowledge of Michael's financial irregularities, knowledge he'd gained through his own investigation of Sarah's accounts and which he'd been using as leverage. Far from being surprised by the theft, David had been counting on it as ammunition in his custody battle. Sarah Bennett was not the victim of a random domestic violence incident, Michael's new attorney announced during a press conference that sent shockwaves through Halifax's legal community. She was murdered because she threatened to expose her siblings' criminal activities and protect her daughter from their manipulation. The revelation triggered a cascade of investigations that brought the Mackenzies' house of cards tumbling down. The Law Society of Ontario reopened their investigation into David's client trust account irregularities and discovered evidence of systematic theft totaling over $340,000 from elderly clients over a 3-year period. Linda's financial advisory business was simultaneously investigated by the Nova Scotia Securities Commission, which uncovered a complex scheme where she'd been selling fraudulent investment products to seniors and pocketing the proceeds. Her victims had lost approximately $180,000 in what prosecutors would later call a calculated betrayal of the most vulnerable members of society. The anonymous tip about Emma's alleged abuse was traced back to a phone number registered to one of Linda's business associates, a clear attempt to frame me using the same tactics they'd employed against Sarah. The leaked information to the Halifax Chronicle-Herald came from David's law office, where he'd used his professional contacts to plant the damaging story. Most shocking of all, the investigation revealed that the Mackenzies had been planning to challenge Sarah's will even before her death. They'd retained a probate attorney in October, 2 weeks before Sarah was murdered, and had been preparing to claim that Sarah was mentally incompetent due to domestic abuse trauma that had compromised her judgment. They were going to destroy Sarah's reputation and steal her daughter's inheritance, whether she was alive or dead, Margaret O'Brien told me as we sat in her living room, reviewing the evidence that had emerged. Your son's crime gave them the perfect cover for what they'd already decided to do. On January 28th, David Mackenzie was arrested at his Toronto law office on charges of theft, fraud, and professional misconduct. Linda was taken into custody the same day at her Vancouver home, facing similar charges plus securities fraud. The siblings who had painted themselves as Emma's loving protectors were revealed as career criminals who saw a 5-year-old orphan as nothing more than a path to financial gain. The collapse of their legal case was swift and total. The wrongful death lawsuit against me was withdrawn within hours of David's arrest. The custody petition was abandoned when both siblings were denied bail due to flight risk concerns. The anonymous abuse allegations were formally dismissed as malicious and unfounded. But the most important victory came on February 2nd, when Emma was returned to my care after exactly 5 weeks in foster care. I'll never forget the moment she ran into my arms outside the CPS office, her little voice saying the words I'd dreamed of hearing. "Grandma, can we go home now?" "Yes, sweetheart," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "We can go home." Our home, however, was no longer the house where this nightmare had begun. The crime scene had been released, but I could never live in those rooms again, knowing what had happened behind that living room wall. Instead, Margaret O'Brien had helped me find a small but comfortable apartment near Emma's school, where we could start building new memories free from the shadows of the past. The legal vindication felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into bright sunlight. But even as I celebrated Emma's return and the Mackenzies' downfall, I knew that our story was far from over. Michael was still facing life in prison for Sarah's murder, and Emma would need years of healing to overcome the trauma of losing her mother and being used as a pawn in her relatives' greed. The final chapter of our nightmare was yet to be written, but for the first time since that terrible October afternoon, I believed it might have a happy ending. Spring arrived in Halifax with an explosion of cherry blossoms and daffodils, but more importantly, it brought the beginning of real healing for Emma and me. Our new apartment on Quinpool Road was small but filled with light, and Emma had chosen yellow paint for her bedroom because it makes me think of happy sunshine, Grandma. The financial settlement came as a surprise that left me speechless. Sarah's estate, which the Mackenzies had tried so desperately to control, was valued at $1.4 million after all assets were properly assessed. As Emma's legal guardian, I would manage these funds until she turned 18. But more immediately, the estate provided the resources Emma and I needed to build a stable future. Mrs. Bennett, estate attorney Patricia Morrison explained during our meeting, Sarah had been very specific about her wishes should anything happen to her. Her will explicitly names you as Emma's preferred guardian and establishes a trust fund that will cover Emma's living expenses, education, and therapeutic needs. The irony was bitter, but satisfying. The Mackenzies had destroyed their own lives trying to steal money that would never have been theirs anyway. Sarah had protected her daughter even from beyond the grave, ensuring that the people who truly loved Emma would have the resources to care for her properly. Dr. Rebecca Chen continued working with Emma twice a week, and the progress was remarkable. The nightmares about being taken away from me had stopped, replaced by normal childhood concerns about making friends at her new school and whether her goldfish, Mr. Bubbles, preferred the tiny castle or the coral reef in his tank. Emma is showing incredible resilience, Dr. Chen told me during one of our monthly consultations. Children are amazingly adaptable when they feel safe and loved. She's processing her trauma in a healthy way, and her attachment to you is providing the stability she needs to heal. But the most meaningful development was Emma's growing understanding of what had happened to her family. We'd agreed that honesty, delivered in age-appropriate ways, was better than secrets and lies. Emma knew that her daddy had done something very wrong that hurt her mommy, and that he was in a place where people go when they've broken important rules. Daddy made a very bad choice, she told me one evening, as we worked on a puzzle together, a new tradition we'd established in our fresh start. But that doesn't mean I'm going to make bad choices, right, Grandma? Right, sweetheart, I assured her. You're going to make your own choices, and you're going to make good ones because you have a good heart. The legal epilogue unfolded throughout the summer. David Mackenzie was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for theft and fraud, with additional professional sanctions that would prevent him from practicing law ever again. Linda received 5 years for securities fraud and was ordered to pay full restitution to her elderly victims, money she no longer had after her assets were seized. Michael's case took a different turn than anyone expected. His decision to cooperate fully with authorities and provide evidence against the Mackenzies, combined with his clear expression of remorse and his desire to spare Emma further trauma, led to a plea agreement. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Michael wrote in a letter he sent to Emma on her 6th birthday. I know what I did was unforgivable. I just want you to know that your mommy loved you more than anything in the world, and that your Grandma Dorothy is the best person I know. Listen to her, learn from her, and be the amazing person I know you can be. Emma wasn't ready to read that letter yet, but I saved it for when she might be, someday in the future when she was old enough to understand the complexity of love, loss, and the consequences of our choices. The civil lawsuit against the Mackenzies resulted in a settlement that recovered not only the $847,000 Michael had stolen from Sarah's accounts, but also additional damages for the emotional trauma they'd inflicted on Emma and me. The money was placed in Emma's trust fund, ensuring her financial security for life. But the most valuable settlement came in the form of an official apology from Child Protective Services and the Halifax Regional Police for their handling of the abuse allegations. The investigation had revealed systematic flaws in how anonymous tips were processed and how quickly children could be removed from their homes without proper verification. We failed Dorothy Bennett and Emma, and we're implementing new protocols to ensure this never happens again, CPS Director Robert McLean announced during a press conference that felt like vindication for every moment of doubt and fear I'd endured. As summer turned to autumn, exactly 1 year after our nightmare began, Emma started 1st grade at a new school where none of her classmates knew about our family's tragedy. She was just Emma Bennett, a bright little girl who lived with her grandmother and loved reading books about brave princesses and talking animals. Watching her skip into her classroom that first morning, her new backpack bouncing with each step, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Simple, uncomplicated joy. The little girl who had pointed at my living room wall and changed our world forever was thriving, healing, and building a future that her mother would have been proud of. Our story had been marked by unimaginable tragedy, but it was also a testament to the power of truth, the strength of love, and the resilience of the human spirit. Emma and I had survived the worst that life could throw at us, and we'd emerged stronger than before. 2 years after that terrible October day, life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Emma, now 7, was flourishing in 2nd grade and had made friends who invited her to birthday parties and sleepovers. Our apartment had become a real home, filled with Emma's artwork, her growing collection of books, and the comfortable chaos of a grandmother and granddaughter building a life together. The unexpected visitor arrived on a cold February morning when Halifax was buried under 2 feet of snow. I was helping Emma build a snowman in our building's courtyard when a young woman approached us, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you Dorothy Bennett?" My protective instincts immediately kicked in. After everything we'd been through, unexpected visitors made me nervous, but there was something familiar about this woman's face. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. "I'm Amanda Mackenzie," she said, and my blood ran cold until she quickly continued. "I'm Sarah's cousin, David and Linda's cousin too, but I haven't spoken to them in years. I've been trying to find you for months." Amanda was 28 years old, a social worker from Montreal who had grown up hearing stories about her difficult cousins, David and Linda, but had maintained a close relationship with Sarah. She'd been traveling internationally for work when Sarah was murdered, and had only learned about the custody battle and her cousin's arrests when she returned to Canada months later. "Sarah used to talk about you all the time," Amanda told me, as we sat in a nearby Tim Hortons while Emma played with the toys from her kids' meal. "She said you were the mother she'd always wished she'd had, and that Emma was so lucky to have a grandmother who loved her unconditionally." But Amanda hadn't just come to offer condolences. She carried with her a manila envelope that contained something Sarah had given her for safekeeping months before her death, a letter addressed to me that Sarah had asked Amanda to deliver if anything ever happened to her. With trembling hands, I opened the letter that my daughter-in-law had written during those final, frightening months when she was trying to protect her family from her siblings' threats. "Dear Dorothy, if you're reading this, then something terrible has happened to me, and I need you to know things that I couldn't say while I was alive. Michael has been struggling with depression and anxiety for months, and I've been afraid that David and Linda's threats might push him to do something desperate. I've been trying to get him professional help, but he's been too proud to admit he needs it. I want you to know that I never believed you were anything but the most wonderful grandmother Emma could have. If David and Linda try to take Emma away from you, please fight them with everything you have. They don't love her. They see her as a commodity, a way to get access to money they think they deserve. I've been documenting their threats and their criminal activities because I know they'll try to destroy our family if I don't stop them first. Amanda has copies of everything, and she knows where to find the evidence if something happens to me. Most importantly, I need you to know that I love you like a mother, and I trust you with the most precious thing in my world. Emma belongs with you, not with people who see her as a dollar sign. Be strong, be brave, and never doubt that you're exactly the grandmother she needs. All my love, Sarah." Reading Sarah's words, written in her careful handwriting, felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave. She had known that her siblings might eventually succeed in hurting her, but she'd also known that I would fight to protect Emma. Her faith in me had been a gift that sustained me through the darkest months of the custody battle. But Amanda brought more than just a letter. She'd been working with investigators to uncover additional evidence of David and Linda's crimes, evidence that resulted in additional charges and longer prison sentences for both siblings. "There's something else," Amanda said, pulling out a second envelope. Sarah left instructions about this too. She wanted Emma to have something when she was old enough to understand. The second envelope contained a video message that Sarah had recorded on her phone, a loving message for her daughter that began with words that made my heart soar. "My beautiful Emma, if you're watching this, it means that you're safe with Grandma Dorothy, exactly where I always wanted you to be." We decided that Emma wasn't quite ready for that video yet, but knowing it existed gave me comfort. Someday, when she was older and had more questions about her mother, Emma would be able to hear directly from Sarah how much she was loved and how carefully her future had been planned. Amanda became a regular presence in our lives, visiting Halifax every few months and staying in touch between visits. Emma adored her cousin Amanda, who brought stories about Sarah's childhood and helped fill in the gaps in Emma's understanding of her mother's life. "You know," Amanda told me during one of her visits, "Sarah always said that families aren't just about blood relationships. They're about the people who choose to love you and stick with you through everything. You and Emma are proof of that." As spring returned to Halifax for the third time since our ordeal began, I reflected on how much our lives had changed. Emma was thriving in school, excelling in reading and making friends easily. Our financial security was assured thanks to Sarah's careful planning and the legal settlements. Most importantly, we'd built a support network of people who cared about us. Margaret O'Brien, Dr. Chen, Amanda, and even some of the neighbors in our building who'd become surrogate family. The trauma of those dark months had left scars, but they'd also revealed the strength Emma and I didn't know we possessed. We'd survived the worst that life could throw at us, and we'd done it together. But our story had one more chapter to write, one final twist that would complete our journey from tragedy to triumph. 5 years had passed since Emma pointed at my living room wall and changed our world forever. She was now 10 years old, a bright and confident fourth grader who played soccer, loved to read mystery novels, and had recently announced that she wanted to become either a veterinarian or a detective when she grew up. "Because I want to help animals, or I want to solve mysteries like you did, Grandma," she explained with the logic that only a 10-year-old could apply to career planning. The call came on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 5 years after that first terrible phone call from Michael. This time, however, the voice on the other end brought news that I'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. "Mrs. Bennett," said Michael's parole officer, "your son is being released next month. He's served 8 years of his sentence, and the parole board has approved his application based on his exemplary behavior and his completion of anger management and addiction counseling programs." Michael's transformation during his imprisonment had been remarkable. He'd earned his GED, completed a bachelor's degree in social work through a prison education program, and had become a mentor to younger inmates struggling with addiction and mental health issues. His letters to me over the years had shown a man working hard to understand and atone for his crimes. But the most important question remained unanswered. Did Emma want to see her father? We'd been preparing for this possibility for months with Dr. Chen's guidance. Emma had been asking more questions about Michael lately, prompted partly by a school assignment about family trees that had forced her to confront the complexity of her father's absence. "Is Daddy still in the place where people go when they break rules?" she asked me one evening as we worked on homework together. "Yes," I told her, "but he might not have to stay there much longer. How would you feel about that?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I think I'd like to see him," she said finally. "But I want you to come with me, and I want to ask him some questions." The reunion took place in a neutral location, a family counseling center that specialized in helping families reconnect after incarceration. Dr. Chen was present, along with Michael's parole officer and a social worker who would help facilitate the conversation. Michael looked older than his 43 years, his hair prematurely gray and his face marked by the weight of what he'd done. But when Emma walked into the room, holding my hand tightly, his eyes filled with tears that spoke of years of regret and hope. "Hi, Emma," he said softly, making no move to approach her. "You've grown so much. You look just like your mother." Emma studied her father with the intense curiosity she applied to everything new and important. "Hi, Daddy," she said, then launched into the questions she'd been preparing. "Why did you hurt Mommy? And why did you lie about it? And do you still love me, even though you did bad things?" The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult and beautiful things I'd ever witnessed. Michael answered every question with complete honesty, taking full responsibility for his actions, while assuring Emma that nothing she had done or could ever do would change his love for her. "I made choices that hurt people I loved," he told her. "I was scared and angry and I didn't know how to ask for help. But none of that was your fault, and none of it means I love you any less." Emma listened carefully, asked follow-up questions, and eventually made a decision that surprised everyone. "I think I'd like to see you sometimes, but I want to keep living with Grandma. Is that okay?" Michael's relief was visible. "That's more than okay, Emma. Grandma Dorothy is the best person I know, and you're exactly where you should be." The reintegration process was slow and carefully supervised. Michael moved to a halfway house in Halifax and began working as a counselor for men struggling with addiction and domestic violence, a job that allowed him to use his education and his hard-won understanding of his own failures to help others avoid similar mistakes. He saw Emma once a week for supervised visits that gradually extended from 1 hour to entire afternoons. They went to museums, played mini-golf, and had long conversations about everything from Emma's favorite books to her questions about her mother's life. "You know what's funny?" Emma told me after one of these visits. "Daddy's different than I remember. He listens better now, and he doesn't get mad about things. Prison must have taught him how to be calmer. 6 months after Michael's release, we faced a decision that would have seemed impossible during the custody battle. Michael asked if he could be part of Emma's life permanently, not as her guardian, but as her father, with me remaining her primary caregiver and legal guardian. "I know I'll never be able to undo what I did," he told me during one of our difficult but necessary conversations. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be the father Emma deserves now, even if I failed to be the husband Sarah deserved." The arrangement we worked out was unconventional but effective. Michael rented a small apartment near our building and became a regular presence in Emma's life, helping with homework, attending school events, and providing the kind of steady, patient fathering that he'd been incapable of during his marriage. Emma thrived with this expanded family structure. She had her grandmother for day-to-day care and unconditional love, her father for the unique relationship that only fathers and daughters can share, and the memory of her mother preserved in stories, photographs, and Amanda's regular visits. On the 5th anniversary of Sarah's death, the three of us visited her grave together for the first time. Emma had written a letter to her mother, which she read aloud while Michael and I stood quietly nearby. "Dear Mommy, I'm 10 years old now, and I'm doing really good in school. Grandma takes good care of me, and Daddy is learning how to be a better person. I miss you every day, but I'm not scared anymore. I know you're watching over me, and that you're proud of how our family figured out how to love each other even after bad things happened. I love you forever and always, Emma." As we walked back to the car, Emma between Michael and me, I reflected on the long journey that had brought us to this moment. We'd started as a family destroyed by violence, greed, and betrayal. We'd survived attempts to tear us apart, fought legal battles that seemed impossible to win, and endured months of uncertainty and fear. But we'd also discovered that love is stronger than trauma, that truth eventually defeats lies, and that families can be rebuilt even after they've been shattered. Emma had grown from a traumatized 5-year-old, keeping terrible secrets, into a confident young girl who understood that people can change, that forgiveness is possible, and that she was surrounded by adults who would protect her with their lives. Michael had transformed from a man capable of murder into someone dedicating his life to helping others avoid the mistakes that had cost him everything. I had evolved from a naive grandmother who trusted blindly into a fierce protector who would never again underestimate the lengths people will go to for money or power. Most importantly, Emma had learned that she was loved, completely, unconditionally, and permanently, by people who had chosen to fight for her when fighting seemed hopeless. As we drove home through the Halifax streets where our nightmare had begun 5 years earlier, Emma fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window. Michael and I rode in comfortable silence, both of us understanding that we'd been given something precious and rare, a second chance. Our story began with the most innocent words that revealed the darkest secrets. "Grandma, Mommy's in there." But it ended with something I never thought I'd experience again. A family, imperfect and unconventional, but bound together by love, forgiveness, and the hard-won knowledge that some bonds are too strong to be broken by any amount of tragedy. If you've followed our journey to this point, I want you to know that healing is possible, that justice sometimes prevails, and that love really can overcome the darkest circumstances. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support has meant the world to me as I've shared our story. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Knowing that people around the world have heard Emma's story and found hope in our survival gives meaning to everything we've endured. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for believing that even the most broken families can find their way back to love.